You need to hear this, because what happened to these Appalachian Trail hikers in the Smoky Mountains has never been fully explained. In June of 2024, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains section of the Appalachian Mountains, two friends set out on what should have been an easy 3-day loop along one of the most patrolled corridors on the entire trail. Everything felt routine until they passed a park ranger a mile in, and something about him was wrong in a way neither of them could name yet. By the time the search teams reached them, one woman was gone. One was found half frozen in a cave with no memory of how she got there. And the National Park Service has spent almost 2 years declining to release the full incident report. What you are about to hear is the account. Her name was Valerie, and this happened to her. It started as a completely normal Tuesday. Valerie Okafor was 25, and her job was about as unglamorous as it gets. She worked as a field test engineer for a satellite communicator startup, strapping prototype SOS devices onto strangers and hikers to see if the signal held up in places where regular phones died. She never went anywhere without one clip to her pack strap. This trip was no different. The unit riding on her shoulder had about 30 hours of battery left before it dropped into emergency ping-only mode, and she joked about it that morning, telling her college roommate Fern she had until Thursday before she turned into a pumpkin. Fern just wanted ramps and mountain laurel for her plant photography page. That was the whole reason they picked this stretch, the walk from Newfound Gap out toward Charlies Bunion. It's one of the busiest, most photographed corridors in the entire park. Families do it in tennis shoes. It's supposed to be the safe one, and that part matters more than you'd think. They started out around 9 in the morning. The parking lot was already half full, tailgates down, dogs on leashes, the normal churn of a trail that sees thousands of boots a year. Valerie's device blinked its little green light every few minutes, logging their position. Nobody thought twice about it. At the trailhead, before they even started walking, Valerie noticed something carved into the wooden signpost right under the mileage marker. Tally marks, 4 groups of 5 and 3 extra on top of that. Old ones, weathered gray by years of rain. She figured it was some hiker tradition, a summit count, or an inside joke between rangers, and she didn't think about it again. A mile and a half in, the trail narrows where the balsam firs crowd in close on both sides. That's when Valerie noticed the silence. Not quiet. Silence. The parking lot noise behind them had cut out completely, and so had everything else. No birds, no wind moving through the branches. Fern didn't notice. She was too busy scanning the underbrush for ramps. But the silence wasn't total. Somewhere below the ridge, something was moving through laurel thick enough that a full-grown deer couldn't push through it clean. And it wasn't moving fast. It was moving like it had somewhere to be and no reason to hurry. They were 20 minutes from the overlook when they heard it behind them. Boots on gravel, even, unhurried, closing the distance a lot faster than a man that age should have been able to move. Valerie glanced back first, and whatever she saw coming up that trail behind them made her slow her steps without even meaning to. The man closing the gap behind them turned out to be wearing a ranger's uniform, or something close to it. But the second he got within 20 feet, Valerie's stomach dropped a little, and she couldn't have told you exactly why. His shirt was the right shade of green mostly, except the collar was torn and had faded to almost gray, like it had been washed 100 times too many or left out in the sun for way too long. He had one hiking boot on his right foot and a scuffed-up work boot on his left, the kind you'd wear to pour concrete, not patrol a trail. When he introduced himself, his voice was friendly enough, but Valerie realized about 10 seconds later that she couldn't actually remember the name he'd said. It was like it slid right off her brain. Fern didn't notice any of it. She just smiled and said hello back, the way you do to anyone in a uniform out here, because uniforms usually mean safety. The ranger reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper, already soft and dirty at the folds, like it had been opened and closed in someone's pocket for weeks. A phone number was scrawled across it in pen, not printed, not on any official card stock. "If anything happens out here," he said, "call that number first. It's a lot faster than dispatch." He smelled like wet copper and gasoline, and Fern figured he'd probably been out clearing trail with a chainsaw that morning. That explanation made sense to her, so she filed it away and didn't think about it again. Valerie's job had spent 2 years training her to distrust anything that wasn't standardized. Official gear doesn't look like a folded gas station receipt with a handwritten number on it. But saying something out loud, right there on the trail, felt insane. So she said nothing. She just watched Fern tuck the paper into her jacket pocket like it was the most normal thing in the world. He was gone around the bend of the trail before either of them thought to ask the obvious question. Why was a park ranger walking this corridor completely alone, with no radio clipped to his belt, carrying a folding knife holstered backward on his hip like it belonged to someone else's body? They kept walking. The trail climbed steadily, and Valerie pulled her satellite device up to check the battery, mostly out of habit. 28 hours left before it dropped into its emergency mode. She said it out loud to Fern like a running joke between them, something about turning into a pumpkin by Thursday, and Fern laughed, and for a few minutes things felt normal again. That normal feeling didn't last. About 5 miles in, Fern stopped dead in the middle of the trail. Just past a low boundary rope marking off a restoration area, she'd spotted a patch of wild ramps growing thick near a stand of blooming mountain laurel. It was exactly what she'd come out here for. She stepped over the rope without a second thought, camera already halfway to her face. Valerie stood there for a second, every instinct from the last mile screaming at her to just stay on the trail. She'd spent the better part of an hour ignoring a bad feeling in her gut, telling herself it was nothing. The same way people tell themselves a lot of things out in the woods. But watching her best friend wander off alone into unmarked terrain, right after a stranger in a half uniform had handed them a number scrawled on trash paper, was worse than any bad feeling. So she stepped over the rope too, telling herself she was just going to keep an eye on Fern for 5 minutes. That's the thing about bad decisions out here. They rarely feel like decisions at all. They feel like the only reasonable option in the moment, right up until they don't. Valerie followed her friend off the trail and into the laurel, and the ground beneath the leaves wasn't as solid as it looked. The trap caught her mid-step, and for a second Valerie didn't even understand what had happened. Then the pain arrived all at once, hot and metallic, and she was on the ground before she could stop herself. Her ears were ringing. Somewhere past that ringing, Fern was screaming her name. Fern spun around and saw the steel jaws locked around her friend's leg, and for one horrible second neither of them said anything at all. Blood was already soaking through the denim, dark and spreading fast. Fern dropped to her knees beside her, hands shaking so bad she almost dropped her phone twice trying to dig the folded scrap of paper out of her jacket pocket. She dialed the handwritten number with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The line connected on the first ring, but before anyone ever picked up, they heard it. Somewhere downhill, muffled like it was buried inside a shirt pocket, a phone started buzzing, ringing in perfect time with the one pressed against Fern's ear. Neither of them said it out loud. There wasn't time. He was there within minutes, which didn't make sense because he hadn't run. Valerie noticed that. He'd just walked, steady and unhurried, the same pace as before, and somehow That was worse than if he'd sprinted. Fern was too busy being grateful to notice anything at all. Metal teeth. Denim tearing further as he worked the jaws open. Blood, warm against Valerie's hand where she pressed it to the wound. He was already moving toward them before Fern had finished dialing, and for one long second the forest went dead quiet again. That same wrong silence from a mile back, like it was waiting to see what they'd do next. "This is worse than it looks," he said, and Valerie almost laughed because it did not look good. He said he needed gear from his truck, something to splint it properly, and he asked Fern to come help him carry it back. Valerie's gut screamed at her not to let that happen. "Don't split up." She tried to say something, but the words came out thick and slow, and Fern was already standing, already following him down the slope, telling Valerie she'd be right back. He came back alone. Valerie asked where Fern was, and her voice barely worked right. "She's at the ranger station," he said. "Had her ride down with the truck, faster than walking her back up." He unscrewed the cap on his own water bottle and held it to her lips, and she drank because her throat was on fire and her leg felt like it belonged to someone else. The water tasted faintly bitter underneath the plastic, chemical, wrong in a way she couldn't place. He loaded her into the truck, said they'd meet Fern there. Everything after that got slow and heavy, like walking through water. The console had a dark stain soaked into the fabric between the seats, old enough that it had dried into ridges. A grizzly did that, he told her yesterday. Attacked him bad, tore up the truck before he got it under control. Some small, clear part of her brain, the part not yet drowning in whatever was in that water, knew grizzlies hadn't lived in these mountains in over 100 years. That thought floated up and then sank again before she could hold on to it, pulled under by the same heavy fog dragging her eyelids down. Her eyes kept sliding shut. She fought it, blinking hard, forcing herself to look anywhere but at him. The window glass was cold against her forehead when she let it rest there, and outside, the trees blurred past in long green streaks, faster than her mind could track. That's when she saw it. Wedged into the door pocket beside her, half covered by a greasy rag, was a phone with a cracked case. She knew that case. She'd watched Fern drop it on concrete a dozen times. If Fern was at the ranger station, waiting, safe. Why was her phone still in this truck, sitting right there against Valerie's hand like it had been left for her to find? The switchback came up fast, the truck slowing just enough to lean into the curve, and Valerie's hand found the door handle before her mind had finished deciding anything at all. Her body just moved. She threw her weight into the door and the mountain came up to meet her. Leaf litter. Root. Rock. She rolled through all of it, the world spinning brown and green and gray, until a ledge of exposed stone stopped her hard enough to knock the last of the air out of her lungs. She lay there for a second, ears roaring, tasting copper in the back of her throat. The truck's brake lights flared red through the trees above her. Then his door. She didn't wait to hear his boots. She dragged herself toward the only shelter she could see, a narrow split in the rock face half swallowed by fern and moss, and forced her body into the gap sideways, her hurt legs screaming the whole way. Overhead, the sky that had been clear all morning had gone the color of a bruise, and right as she wedged herself into the dark, it broke wide open. Rain came down in sheets, flattening scent, flattening sound, flattening everything except the hammer of her own pulse in her ears. For a moment, that felt like enough. It wasn't. His voice arrived first, closer than it had any right to be, calling her name like they'd known each other for years instead of hours. "You need to come back," he said, and something about his tone had gone flat and patient, the way you'd talk to a kid who wandered off in a grocery store. "There are things in these woods you don't understand." The rain seemed to hold itself still, just long enough for her to hear every word clearly. She could track him by sound alone. One hiking tread, one flat work sole, uneven, deliberate, moving through the wet leaves with no urgency at all. The steps stopped less than 6 feet from where she was pressed into the dark, close enough that she could hear him breathing, slow and even, like a man who already knew exactly how this was going to end. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Somewhere behind her ribs, her heart was slamming so hard she was sure he could hear it too. A long minute passed, then another. The boots shifted, turned, and started walking away, back toward the truck, unhurried the way everything about him had been unhurried since the trail. The relief hit her all at once, a wave so strong it almost undid her right there in the dark. It lasted exactly as long as it took her eyes to adjust to the crevice around her. She was not alone in it. Something was in the far corner of the crack in the rock, folded into a space that didn't look big enough to hold a grown man standing upright. And it had been breathing the entire time, slow, even, patient in a way that had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with the truck, nothing to do with anything she understood about what was hunting her on this mountain. She made a decision, very clearly, in the middle of all that fear. She was not going to look at the corner again. Rain kept hammering the rock outside, filling the crevice with the smell of wet stone and old moss, and underneath all of it, faint and rhythmic, that breathing kept going, in, out, patient, waiting to see what she would do. Her leg had gone numb below the knee, the bear trap's damage finally catching up with the drug still working through her system, and the two things together dragged at her like weights. She fought to stay upright, fought to stay aware, because some animal part of her understood that whatever was breathing behind her would only move if she gave it a reason to. Water dripped somewhere deep in the rock, slow and steady, counting off seconds she couldn't afford to lose. She thought about Fern's phone in that door pocket. She thought about the tally marks carved into the trailhead sign, 4 groups of 5 and 3 more, and for the first time all day, a number that had meant nothing suddenly felt like it meant everything. The breathing behind her changed, just slightly, like something shifting its weight, settling in for a longer wait than she had strength left to give it. Valerie didn't remember losing consciousness. She only remembered the very last thing she was sure of before the dark closed all the way in, which was that whatever was sharing that space with her had never once made a sound like it was going to leave. Search and rescue found her almost a full day later, guided to that exact crevice by a trail of pings no human being ever had to plot by hand. Her satellite device, the one she joked about all morning, the one with 30 hours of battery, had kept logging her coordinates every 10 minutes since the trailhead, independent of the phone dying in her pocket, independent of anything happening to her at all. It just kept doing its job. It was the only thing out there that had. She had no memory of the walkout. She remembered the crevice, the breathing, and then nothing until a stranger's hands were checking her pulse, and someone was saying her name in a voice that wasn't his. There was no ranger station on that stretch of the corridor. There never had been one within 20 miles of where he told her Fern would be waiting. 2 ridges over, in a cabin set back off an old logging road, searchers found Fern locked inside with 3 other women. 4 names. 4 lives. The same number carved into the trailhead post Valerie had glanced at that morning and forgotten by the second mile. Nobody who worked that trailhead had an explanation for who had been cutting those marks, or how long the practice had been going on before anyone thought to count them. The man turned out to be an escaped convict who had been living off that stretch of the corridor for over a year, posing as park staff to isolate hikers who wandered too far off the beaten path. He called them collections. That word showed up in more than one witness statement, and nobody who heard it ever asked him to clarify what he meant by it. What never made it into any official report was the crevice itself. Search and rescue photographed it before they left, standard procedure, and somewhere in that documentation is a set of 4 parallel gouges cut into the rock, 8 feet up the inside wall, well above anything a person could reach standing on the ground. Nobody has offered an explanation for those marks. Nobody who was there wants to guess out loud. Valerie went home. She kept the job. She still straps prototype devices onto strangers, still tests the signal in places phones aren't supposed to work, and she tells people the extra battery is the whole reason she's alive to talk about any of it, which is true as far as it goes. Months later, she found herself at a different trailhead entirely, states away, a quiet gravel lot on a morning that felt exactly like that Tuesday had. She stood there for a minute before she started walking, listening. The birds had gone quiet. The wind had dropped out of the trees the way it had that first time, that same silence with something moving underneath it, patient, unhurried, waiting to see what she'd do. This time she turned around and got back in her car. The thing people keep asking about isn't the man in the uniform. It's the crevice, 8 feet up a rock wall, in a space too small for a full-grown man to even stand upright in. Search and rescue never explained it. The National Park Service never released the full file. And Valerie, when she talks about that day at all, never once mentions what she saw in the corner before the dark took her under, only that she made a decision not to look at it again. And that decision is the only reason this story exists to be told at all.